Please do something. Despair tore at me from the inside like torn glass, scratched my throat, but found no response in the cold eyes of my husband and mother-in-law. My face was distorted in a silent scream, but they stood by, as if indifferent, watching me, covered in blood, trying to gather the last remnants of strength. On the dirty floor, where there was no choice where to sit, I felt like a hunted animal, and yet I couldn't afford to break down, not now. I called an ambulance myself, and while the siren wailed in the street, tears prevented me from seeing. It seemed like the whole world was spinning around in an alarming kaleidoscope of pain and fear. As soon as I was in the ambulance, the phone came to life, interrupting the deafening silence in the car, and Patrick's harsh voice burst into the space full of panic. "Hey, turn the ambulance around." "My mom, this is my mom," he screamed as if I didn't exist, as if my suffering was just a shadowy background for caring for his mother. "My name is Julie. Patrick and I are 37 years old. I've known him since my friend, cheerful, carefree, insisted that I go to a party with her. That was 5 years ago. I didn't really like such events, especially with the civil service, where everyone considered it their duty to behave arrogantly. But my friend laughed, said that I should finally get out of my comfort zone, find something new. That's where I met Patrick. He was 5 years younger than me, and his insecurity manifested itself in everything from the buttons on his shirt buttoned in the wrong order to the halting phrases of a toast. He was sweet and a little distracted, like a random passerby who went to the wrong place but decided to stay. This awkward and touching image of Patrick somehow hooked me. To me, who grew up in a family where everything revolved around strength and endurance, his gentleness and modesty were something new, causing an unusual warmth. My father was a strict judo instructor, my mother was a physical education teacher, and I and my 2 older brothers, each of whom had a black belt, used to live by the law of force. I was a bit of a tomboy, the way people saw her, but in the presence of Patrick, something in me softened. I took the first step. We went on several dates, and his insecurity only reinforced my desire to take care of him. His gentle nature calmed my temperament, and before I knew it, the thought that I wanted to be with him forever filled me completely. On our first anniversary, I decided and proposed to him. I remember saying, "I want to take care of you for the rest of my life, so let's get married." Tears filled his eyes as he smiled and replied, "Julie, that should have been my words. Thanks for everything. Let's continue to take care of each other." So we decided to connect our lives. Patrick was genuinely excited when he came to my parents for dinner. My father sat with a stony expression on his face, and my brothers, with their arms crossed, looked at him attentively. Mom, always kind and welcoming, tried to defuse the situation, telling Patrick that there was nothing to be afraid of. But he nervously answered yes loudly, and his voice trembled, causing everyone to laugh good-naturedly. My father, although he was a stern man, looked at Patrick and noticed something in him that caused an infrequent but kind smile on his face. He tilted his head as if thinking and said, "He seems a little unsure of himself, but I see that this guy put his soul into every gift he brought you, and this, without a doubt, speaks to his feelings for you." These words sounded unexpectedly warm and clearly showed that my father approved of our union, and for me it was perhaps the most significant of all blessings. After Patrick passed the test of meeting my family, it was his turn to get to know his family. He told me that his father passed away 3 years ago after a long and painful battle with cancer. Patrick's parents had been trying to have children for a long time, and only after 6 years of endless efforts and hopes did they finally have a son. Patrick told me this with a special trepidation, with which, perhaps, he rarely shared his memories with me. His father was the epitome of strength for him, and his mother was a source of quiet, inconspicuous love that accompanied him all his life. I've never considered myself a nervous person, but the day we went to his mother's, I felt the excitement gradually envelop me, no matter how hard I tried to brush it off. What if she doesn't like me? What if I embarrassingly say something inappropriate at the first greeting? All these thoughts were racing through my head like a swarm of bees, and Patrick, noticing my concern, quietly said, "Don't worry. My mother is very kind and always smiling. That's what she's known for in the neighborhood." His words sounded so confident that I felt a little emboldened, as if promising myself that I would meet this new acquaintance with all openness and warmth. "And you know what, Julie?" he added, squeezing my hand, "no one can help but like you." When I heard that, I smiled, and the feeling of anxiety seemed to turn paler. When we reached his family's house, I pulled myself together, keeping my breathing even. I rang the doorbell, and a moment later his mother appeared, radiating incredible calm. I introduced myself, unable to contain a slight excitement. "It's very nice to meet you, Mrs. Hope. Thank you so much for taking the time to meet with me today." A warm, almost familiar smile appeared on her face, and she replied softly, "Oh, come on, these formalities, Julie. Come in, I'm so glad to see you." She was wearing a beautiful, elegant dress. Her appearance radiated sophistication, and every feature, every gesture of hers showed subtle tenderness and dignity. I forgot about my fears for a moment, and when the conversation turned to the age difference, she said with a smile, "Age doesn't matter at all, Julie. I'm just happy that Patrick found a woman like you." With those words, I felt the last remnant of my anxiety dissipate. I felt that I had found support in her, sincere and genuine. We talked for a long time, and our conversation turned to her memories of an old friend, a cute poodle who had accompanied her for many years. She showed me a photo of a curly-haired, snow-white-haired dog looking at the camera with his trusting eyes. "Isn't he adorable? I had this dog when I was in elementary school," she said sadly, "such a friendly and intelligent dog. He left when he got older, but he still lives in my memories." Then Patrick, with a cheerful wink at me, added, "Mom, Julie, doesn't really like dogs." Shirley looked at me in surprise, her warm gaze gently sliding over my face, while I gathered my courage and explained the reason for my fear. "Yes, I'm actually a little afraid of dogs, although maybe you can't tell from me," I began with a slight smile. "When I was a child, I was playing ball with my brother in the park, and then, out of nowhere, a stray dog appeared. When I ran to get the ball, she suddenly pounced and bit my arm. I was so scared then. The blood was flowing freely, and I had to get 5 stitches. Since then, the fear has remained." Shirley froze for a moment, her eyes dark with compassion. "Oh dear, I didn't know. What a terrible experience. I'm so sorry that I talked about dogs, knowing that you're afraid of them." I hurriedly replied, feeling embarrassed for my own confession, No, it's okay, really. And your poodle in the photo was adorable." Shirley smiled warmly and said softly, "Thank you, Julie." When we returned home, I couldn't help but share my impressions with Patrick. "Your mom is so beautiful, kind and just an amazing woman. I understand why you have so much warmth and kindness." Patrick, looking at the road, replied with a proud smile, "I know, Julie. Mom has always been just like that. Her gentle nature attracts everyone who knows her." I nodded, agreeing with him and remembering again how easy and pleasant it was with Shirley. We continued to talk about her, almost excitedly discussing her wonderful qualities. But suddenly Patrick fell silent, becoming unusually serious. "Actually, Julie, I wanted to discuss something important with you." His voice was quiet, but it sounded somehow determined. I turned to him in surprise, and he continued, "Today we were at my family home. This house is not just a place to live. When my father was still alive, he designed it for my mother, with the idea that everything in it would be convenient and comfortable for her. They had plans, because there are even 4 children's rooms in the house, in case they have more children. But it so happened that I was the only child left, and these rooms remained empty." His voice was full of thoughtfulness and a slight sadness as he said, "Now Mom lives there alone, and sometimes she gets too lonely and, frankly, too spacious. I thought, what if we moved in with her? What if we could divide this house and make it more alive? My eyes widened in surprise. The house was really huge, and Shirley kept it in perfect order. Living in such a spacious place surrounded by a manicured garden would probably be a truly amazing experience. But something inside me seemed to be on guard. We were newlyweds, and it seemed that it was still too early for such a step. There are too many new sensations and changes that we haven't had time to get used to yet. I sighed softly, gathering my thoughts, and finally said, "You know, your mom is a wonderful person, and the house is really beautiful, but we just got married. I think we need a little time to enjoy our time together before we think about such a serious decision." Patrick, looking at me intently, sighed and nodded understandingly. "You're right, Julie. I understand. It seemed like a good idea to me, but maybe we can really wait a bit. I'll explain to Mom." I felt a little guilty for leaving Shirley in her empty house, but I knew I was being honest with myself and with Patrick. We were just starting our life together, and it was important for me to share my true feelings, not agreeing just for the sake of convenience. I felt a slight relief when I realized that Patrick understood me, accepted my feelings, and did not insist on moving to his mother. We continued our life together, full of quiet but precious moments. Patrick remained a little clumsy, but his sincere desire to help and attention to detail added warmth to our home. He willingly helped me with household chores, and our life flowed smoothly, like a gentle river. Nothing disturbed its tranquility. However, recently something inside me has been starting to bother me a little. Increasingly, I had to see Patrick talking to his mother on the phone several times a week, and his soft voice always sounded with the same note of concern. "Oh, hi, Mom. Is the light bulb in the living room burned out?" "I'll be right there," he said one evening, quickly packing up to go to her. I asked with a slight smile, hiding behind the words a growing sense of discomfort. "Yes," he replied, already putting on his coat. "I'll quickly replace the light bulb." At first it seemed to me that this was an accident, but soon I noticed that such trips were becoming more and more frequent. One minute she bought a new computer and asked him to help with the setup, then she picked up too many groceries and asked Patrick to pick her up at the supermarket, even if it was an ordinary weekday, when, it would seem, we could spend evenings together. And on weekends, when I was hoping for a quiet time together, the phone invariably rang with a call from Shirley, and Patrick hurried to her again. I didn't want to show it, but sometimes I felt a little annoyed. It seemed to me that it would be possible to at least leave the weekend for us, for something that belongs only to our first days together, while the youth of our marriage is still full of freshness. But then I reminded myself that Patrick was, in fact, a kind and caring person, and his devotion to his mother was part of the kindness that I valued so much in him. It had been a month since we got married, and life seemed to flow serenely. We didn't quarrel, and everything went smoothly, as if time itself blessed our union. Today was a special day, Shirley's birthday, and, full of enthusiasm, together we chose a gift and a beautiful cake for her. I wanted this day to be especially pleasant for all of us. We arrived at her house, and as soon as we entered, a dog suddenly jumped out from around the corner. My breath caught in my throat, and, instantly feeling a surge of fear, I retreated, hiding behind my husband. "Mom, where did this dog come from?" Patrick asked in surprise, and Shirley, coming out of the living room, smiled warmly, noticing our confusion. "Oh, welcome, dear ones," she said happily, looking at us. "I was lonely living alone, so I recently got a dog. Isn't it lovely?" She leaned over to a small, cheerfully wagging tail of a Welsh corgi, who was trying to approach me, his eyes wide open and, it seems, sniffing me with his gaze. "Yes, I see, lovely," I muttered, trying my best to keep a smile on my face, even though my heart was pounding with hidden fear. I felt the tension take hold of me, but Shirley didn't seem to notice it. She pushed the dog towards me with a smile, saying, "Well, Julie, why don't you hold her?" I took a step back, feeling the tension permeate me from head to toe. Gathering my thoughts, I politely reminded her, I think I mentioned when we arrived at the wedding that I was bitten by a dog as a child, and since then I have been afraid of dogs. My refusal was couched in as kind words as possible, but Shirley raised an eyebrow as if she had never heard of it before and pretended to gasp. "Oh, did you talk about it? What a strange person you are," she said with a slight grin. Something barely perceptible resembling sarcasm flashed across her face. From that day on, her words and that subtle shade on her face often surfaced in my memory, like a hidden, restless thought. And although Patrick still reminded me with care, "Mom wants to see you," or "Let's visit Mom," I increasingly found excuses to avoid these meetings. But every time I remembered her grin, it was strange, causing a slight tremor. Another month had passed when, one day, returning home from work, I was surprised to find Shirley in the kitchen. She looked completely at ease, as if my house were her own, and looking at me with a friendly smile, she said, "Oh, welcome home, Julie." She cheerfully rummaged in the refrigerator, humming something to herself, and began to cook dinner. Confused, I asked, "Why are you here so suddenly, Shirley?" She replied, still pleased, "Dear Patrick said he wanted my homemade stew, and I had to come. How can you resist your son's request?" I tried to smile, holding back the involuntary tension, but it was not easy, especially when I noticed that her dog was lying in the living room. My eyes rested on a colorful antique carpet and an elegant plate that I once brought back from a trip to Canada. She was a rare find from the flea market, reminiscent of those distant days and evoking fond memories. Shirley was happy to feed the dog, allowing it to eat from my precious plate, and the dog, in turn, left a wet trail on the floor without touching the food, which apparently did not bother Shirley at all. I took a deep breath, trying to calm down. After putting my bags and coats in the room, I quietly told myself not to get upset, because Shirley, after all, had come all this way to cook dinner for Patrick. But when I returned to the living room, I froze in horror. There was a bright yellow stain on the new carpet. The dog's creativity literally ruined the carpet, and I involuntarily exclaimed, "Oh no, the dog ruined the carpet." I turned to Shirley, expecting at least the slightest regret, but she only nodded casually, slightly shrugging her shoulders, as if it were a trifle. "Oh, yes, I've ruined it, I think," she said without the slightest alarm, not for a second, showing no concern or intention to clean the stain. With pent-up disappointment and concern, I took up a rag and cleaned the carpet myself, realizing that it had to be done immediately, otherwise the stain would not disappear. I was usually calm and tried not to pay attention to the little things, but this situation seemed unbearable to me. My irritation boiled over when the door opened and Patrick came in. The dog's barking was deafening and made me shiver, and as soon as the dog noticed Patrick, its loud barking subsided, but the feeling of tension remained. The three of us sat down at the table. Shirley served her stew. But neither Patrick nor Shirley bothered to put the dog aside or at least put it in a cage. It ran freely under our feet, looking into our eyes with the hope of food. I felt the tension growing stronger inside me, and my hands involuntarily began to tremble. Shirley, catching this, leaned towards me and said with a slight smile, "Julie, darling, are you really afraid of dogs? You look so scared. I brought her here today specifically to help you overcome your fear." When I heard that, I could barely contain my indignation. This dog has already managed to stain the carpet, trample all my favorite antique dishes, and now it's here, next to me, disturbing the remnants of comfort. How was all this supposed to help me overcome my fear? I finally couldn't stand it and said, "If you really want to help, just put the dog in a cage or keep it away from me." But Patrick didn't notice my inner agitation. He just shrugged and, defending his mother, said, "Mom is so kind, Julie. She's really trying to help you." I stared at him in disbelief. The whole situation seemed absurd and evil to me. Shirley insisted that she was doing everything for my benefit, but in fact only increased my fear and discomfort. Patrick, seemingly influenced by his mother's presence, began to speak more harshly than usual, and even lectured me. "Julie, this is not normal. Mom does everything for you, but you keep avoiding the dog and don't even want to come to her house because of your fear. You're not trying hard enough, Julie." His words stabbed me deeper than I could have imagined, and out of desperation I only uttered a restrained, "Excuse me," trying to maintain my composure in front of Shirley. While she was smiling sweetly, I held back my disappointment by biting my lip to hide how much I was hurt by the scene. But soon the situation only began to worsen. Now Shirley started coming to our house regularly and brought her dog with her every time. The dog ran around the house endlessly, making a mess. He turned over something, then left fur on the furniture, but Shirley showed no concern or desire to discipline him. She just looked at the chaos that remained after her visits with a good-natured smile. One day my patience broke down. For too long I had been holding in my irritation, which now burst out like a torrent. I gathered my courage and, trying to remain calm, said, "Please, Shirley, I've explained more than once that I'm afraid of dogs. Could you stop bringing her here?" Shirley stiffened abruptly, and her face, usually calm and friendly, distorted with obvious indignation. I was surprised to see how her gaze became hard. She snapped back, "You're using your fear of dogs as an excuse to avoid me, Julie." I was stunned by her words, and even more so by the fact that Patrick immediately picked up on her accusations. "Julie, this is too much. Mom does so much for us, and all you do is avoid her. It's rude. Apologize to her." I felt something inside me shrink and tremble. "Patrick, Shirley, you both know perfectly well that I'm uncomfortable around a dog, and every time she makes a mess, I have to clean up after her." "It's too much," I replied, barely holding back my voice so that it wouldn't tremble with resentment. But my words did not find understanding. Shirley frowned coldly and said without showing any sympathy, "At least I can spend time with the dog. After all, you're too old to have children anyway, so what's the problem?" I was stunned. Those words seemed to hit me in the heart. "Is that what you really think?" I asked, feeling resentment building inside me. Shirley just shrugged, not looking away. "You're 37 now, and it's getting harder to have children at your age. But Patrick is only 32, he has his whole future ahead of him. And now he's stuck with a woman who's older than him and thinks too highly of herself." Her sarcastic voice literally sobered me up. I was looking at this woman, the one who once claimed that age doesn't matter. After hearing her true feelings, I realized that I could no longer tolerate her in my house. "Please don't come here anymore," I whispered, and my eyes filled with tears. In response to my request, Shirley only became even more indignant. "How dare you, arrogant wife," she shouted and, grabbing the dog, hurriedly ran out the door. Everything has changed since that day. Resentment settled in my heart and slowly turned into bitterness, both at Shirley and at Patrick, who defended her and accused me. The tension between us grew every day, and we almost stopped talking. It seemed that our every gesture and word became prickly and alienated. 2 weekends later, Patrick finally came to me with a serious expression on his face. He sat down across from her and said, "Julie, I'm sorry. I may have been wrong too and didn't take your feelings into account." I felt a little relieved, thinking that he finally understood what I was going through. But then he added, "Let's go now and apologize to Mom." I froze in confusion, trying to make sense of his words. Why should we do this? Was I wrong that day? My husband's words, uttered in a low and almost indifferent tone, hit me like an icy wind. "It's not a matter of who was right or wrong. Just don't piss off Mom, apologize to fix everything," he said, looking past me somewhere, as if my feelings were an insignificant detail in this picture. I realized that he didn't understand anything. He never saw any shadow of my pain or the depth of my fear in all this. And although my heart ached with bitterness, I allowed him to take me to his mother's house against my will, because there was still a hope, albeit a small one, but still a hope that this meeting would somehow help clarify the relationship. When we arrived, Shirley was already standing waiting, clasping her hands on her hips. Her gaze was stern and mocking at the same time. She said, and there was a flicker of barely concealed contempt in her gaze. The words of apology sounded cold and formal on my lips. Shirley, I'm sorry that I was rude to you the other day. This was not said from the heart, but simply to comply with the formalities that Patrick so insistently demanded of me. But Shirley only grinned in response, and her demand stunned me to the core. I'll only forgive you if you hold the dog. That's all. Every word of her sentence echoed in my head like the thud of a hammer. I tried to explain that I couldn't do it, but Shirley, hearing my refusal, flared up with anger for a moment. Gritting her teeth, she roughly pushed the dog towards me. I screamed, instinctively recoiling, but this frightened cry only angered the dog more. She lunged at me, and I felt a sharp, burning pain as her teeth sank into my arm. Blood quickly began to soak the fabric of the sleeve, and I, feeling trembling, almost begged, "Please do something." But Shirley, barely glancing at me, only coldly remarked, "Anyone would be scared of such a loud noise." Poor dog, her voice sounded with a cold note directed at the dog, not at me. My husband, to my horror, completely focused on the stain on the floor, as if it were the most serious of all problems. Neither of them noticed my suffering. It was something completely incomprehensible and humiliating. It became unbearable for me to see their indifferent faces, and I clenched my teeth in pain, drove the dog away and called an ambulance on my own. When the paramedics arrived, Shirley grinned, throwing in my direction, "You're being so dramatic about a dog bite." Her mocking expression was the last thing I saw before I entered the ambulance, holding my hands soaked in blood and holding back tears so they wouldn't run down my cheeks. Sitting alone in the ambulance, exhausted and in pain, I couldn't stop crying. Anger and sadness were growing inside me, which filled my soul with a heavy stone. And when my phone rang, I answered with the hope that Patrick was finally worried about me, that his voice would bring me comfort. But he only said one thing: "Mom was bitten by a dog. Are you still near the house? Tell the driver to come back." At that moment, everything I once felt for Patrick seemed to fade and disappear, disappearing into thin air like morning mist. I realized that I didn't want to think about him or his mother anymore. Let them deal with all this themselves, if it's more important to them. I quietly hung up the phone and closed my eyes, realizing how empty my soul was. When I finally got to the hospital, the doctor examined my wound and said worriedly that it was deeper than it seemed at first glance. I'll have to stay for a few days to avoid the risk of infection. This news took me by surprise, but I knew I would have to adjust. I called my parents, asking them to bring me some things, and barely hearing their worried voices, I realized that they were already on their way. When they arrived, I saw in their eyes a reflection of my own suffering. Anxiety and concern were read in their every movement. Mom rushed to me, hugging me, as if trying to shield me from the pain that settled inside me. "Julie, are you okay? What happened?" Their questions seemed endless, but it was at this moment that their presence and support were my salvation. "It still hurts a little, but so far I'm fine," I replied, barely hiding my tears. I told them the whole story, about the neglect, about the constant disregard for my feelings, about Patrick's indifference and Shirley's cruelty. My mother continued to hug me, as if hesitating to let me out of her arms, and my father, frowning, said with quiet fury, "I will never forgive them for what they did to you." His gaze was full of anger that seemed about to burst out. For the first time in a long time, I felt that there was someone nearby who was able to stand behind me like a wall. The next day, my phone rang, and Patrick's voice sounded strained and harsh. "What the hell is going on, Julie? The police just showed up at our house and are interrogating Mom. Did you complain about her?" I was surprised, but remembering the conversation with the doctor, I realized that the hospital probably had to report the attack. They asked me how I was hurt, and I honestly replied that I was bitten by your mother's dog. I said calmly. What if she gets arrested, Julie? Have you thought about how this will affect us? You don't care about our reputation. There was undisguised anger in his words, but I was already tired of making excuses. Do you really think I care about your reputation? Patrick, we've only been married for 4 months, and in that time you've never once sided with me. Maybe it would be better for both of us if we got divorced. He just laughed at that, bitterly and sharply. Divorce? Do you think it's just like that? It's humiliating, Julie. We'll become a laughing stock. Everyone will talk about our divorce. His voice trembled with rage, but I didn't care. He hung up without even listening to me, but this time I didn't feel any pain, just calm acceptance. 2 weeks later, I was finally discharged from the hospital, and my parents came to take me home. I decided to return to them to regain my strength and think about what to do next. The first thing I did was contact a lawyer to discuss a possible divorce and alimony. I understood that there would be no dialogue with Patrick that would lead to an agreement. He called me over and over again, but I ignored every call he made, realizing that he hardly really cared about me. Finally, after another missed call, a message arrived. I'm at a cafe near your parents' house. You'd better come. I read it and smiled bitterly. If he really wanted to talk, he could have come straight to the house, but, as always, he chose a workaround, forcing me to go to him on his terms. When I arrived at the cafe, Patrick was already waiting, and it was clear from his expression that he was not going to change his point of view. No sooner had I sat down than he uttered the first thing that he probably considered the final decision. I'm not getting divorced. I don't care what you want. I looked at him calmly, feeling that the old doubts and hesitations had long been gone inside. And I'm getting a divorce, Patrick. There's no way I'm staying with you or your mother after everything that's happened, I replied with cold confidence. My words seemed to unsettle him, but he ignored it and immediately began to defend his mother. Don't speak ill of her. It's all your fault. You avoided her because of your far-fetched fear of dogs, and that's what it led to. The dog bit you because you scared it by screaming. His voice sounded stern, as if he was a teacher and I was a guilty student, and at that moment his accusations seemed almost absurd. Before I could answer, my father and 2 brothers entered the cafe. They approached, looking at Patrick with that calmness that only people who are confident in their abilities can have. My father knew about our conversation and decided not to come alone. He called my brothers to give me confidence and support. Surrounded by 3 large men, each of whom was a judoka, Patrick was clearly confused. There was an expression on his face that I had never seen before, fear and confusion. His voice trembled as he muttered, "Oh, father-in-law, sons-in-law." My father looked at him coldly, his expression unyielding. "How dare you hurt my daughter," he said, and his voice sounded like a sentence. Then the father continued, addressing Patrick with stern confidence, "Our sister wants a divorce." The brothers, standing on either side, stared at him intently, their gazes leaving him no chance to dodge. Patrick tried to mumble something, stuttering and shifting from one foot to the other, but under such pressure, the resistance in his eyes melted. Finally, in the voice of an almost hopeless man, he said, "Yes, I agree to a divorce." My father and brothers silently nodded, accepting his words, and I, without wasting a moment, took out the pre-prepared divorce documents and put them in front of Patrick. "Sign it," I said calmly, "we're getting a divorce." Patrick reluctantly took a pen and, looking at us again, signed the papers. I stood up, feeling confident and light-hearted for the first time in a long time. Thanks to the support of my father and brothers, I was finally able to end this painful stage of my life. The divorce was finalized, and my lawyer, following the agreement, also demanded compensation from my former mother-in-law for the physical and moral injuries that I had to go through. As a result, I received alimony from both Patrick and compensation from Shirley for the injuries. Later, I heard that Shirley had indeed been called in for questioning by the police about her dog Bite, and perhaps her assumed arrogance had now lost its force. She was given a stern warning, and as I later found out, Shirley was forced to give up her dog. Her endless indulgence of the pet led to the fact that the dog fancied himself almost the lord of the house and even dared to bite his mistress, breaking her wrist. Now Shirley was living in uncomfortable conditions, barely using her sore arm, and this led to unexpected changes. My ex-husband Patrick returned to his parents' house to be with his mother, but quickly realized that living with her turned out to be much more difficult than he imagined. Now, with limited mobility, Shirley increasingly asked Patrick to help with the housework, washing clothes, then cooking. But for Patrick, who had never touched household chores before, it all turned out to be an impossible test. Their life together became unbearable, because his inability to cope with daily duties caused constant quarrels. Accusing her that all their troubles were the result of her own mistakes, Patrick did not hide his irritation and anger as a wall of misunderstanding and resentment grew between them. Meanwhile, rumors of our divorce began to spread rapidly among his relatives and colleagues. It was said that he mistreated me, and his role as a mama's boy, devoid of independence and firmness, became the cause of ridicule. His pride was hurt, and in a way, I felt it was good for him. I will not hide that I had a hand in this. During my stay in the hospital, I deliberately shared the story of my marriage with one of his colleagues, whose contact details I had. This man was reputed to be a lover of gossip, and I was sure that what I heard would not remain with him. Everything turned out perfectly. Soon at work they started talking about Patrick's behavior, calling him a cruel man who depended on his mother. His reputation was tarnished and he became an easy target for ridicule, but to be honest, I thought he deserved it. Now, with the support of my family, I found peace and felt that my life was getting colors again. I made plans and relearned how to be happy, reminding myself that this is what I deserve.